So let's officially start with this session. We're hosting Professor Richard Robbins tonight. No, yeah, tonight is for me tonight. It's like almost 9 o'clock here in India. Um, so we have an hour and a half, so I don't feel too pressed to make it short, the introduction. And I want to first highlight one of his books that had impact also on my own life, and also on the writing and study partner of Richard Robbins, Tim DiMuzio, from Canada. We both read at one time in our academic, formation, this textbook by Richard Robbins, and now also his daughter is involved in creating new editions. The title is Global Problems and the Culture of Capitalism, and it's now in its seventh edition. And so 12 or 13 years ago, I took a sociology class on global problems. And this textbook was one of the textbooks that we had to read. And it was a fabulous adventure because Dr. Robbins goes into the narratives on the ground of a lot of things that are happening in the world that have to do with money, with exchanges, with enforcement, with imperialism, with you name it, is there. And the most important or most intriguing part is that in the beginning, there is a section about money as kind of the driving machinery of capitalism, imperialism, and how this system multiplied itself throughout the world. And it had a big impact on me because I thought it was really good, way of teaching. And Dr. Robbins is recognized as a distinguished teaching professor. He's not an economist. He's not a sociologist, but apparently he is a anthropologist there. But maybe Dr. Robbins can fill in that little further. One of the interesting effects that sociology class had by reading his textbook was that I picked out some really interesting other academics. One of them this was my first exposure to the work of David Korten. And this now, after 12, 13 years, led to having recruited him at the beginning of our conference. And because I found out also from Korten that already in 1999, in one of his books on how corporations rule the world, he was already aware of the credit creation theory of money, the one that we subscribe to, and also was proposing sovereign money as a solution. So he was there already, like now, 26 years ago. The other thing, and this goes back also to the some of the terms that were used by Zabor and Horvath, was the world, has a core. There are peripheral countries, there are semi-peripheral countries. The peripheral countries are the really poor ones. The semi-peripherals are not as strong and economically developed as, let's say, Western Europe, United States, Canada, Japan, etc. But they are kind of in the middle. So India might be a little bit as a semi-peripheral country, but that terminology comes from, and that is another great find that I found with the book of Richard Robbins, Immanuel Wallerstein, the great American sociologist, neo-Marxist sociologist, who gives us really nice insights about the structure, the economic, political structure of the world. And he has very detailed, very insightful research papers. So that's one of the things that I like to bring forward. And maybe next year we could invite someone to do a presentation on Wallerstein, and it might even be Dr. Robbins because he might be very familiar also with that work. Okay, so much about then his textbook. Later, he also wrote Culture of Anthropology, a problem-based approach. So that's also a textbook. But in the realm of monetary theory, one of my favorite books is Debt as Power. And the subtitle is Theory for a Global Age. The title is a subtle reference to another important study that came out in 2009 by Jonathan Nitzan and Shimson Bichler. That's a very dense but interesting study, Capital as Power, a study of order and pre-order. And it really is about how capital is so formative, how money is so formative of the kind of civilization, the kind of economy, the kind of society that we're living in. So their title, Debt as Power, is a little twist on the title of Capital as Power, because our money system is debt-based. So it's debt money that is the driving force of the capitalist system and whatever it is doing. So I can very much recommend that book for you guys to study. Then there's also a textbook that was published by Routledge, An Anthropology of Money. And that was with Tim DiMuggio, who had also read somewhere in his reading The Global Problems and the Culture of Capitalism. But he made the good step then to get connected with Dr. Robbins. So it's another one to be recommended. Dr. Robbins has presented before on our AMI conferences. During the COVID, he presented one titled Once in a Lifetime Opportunity, COVID-19 and the Economy. And in 2023, the title was Sovereign Money and the Tyranny of the Rate of Return, about the 300, I don't know, trillion or billion, I don't know, massive amount of money that's going around that's looking for a return. And that's there's a certain image of aggressivity of how to get that and how to roll over, the environment, roll over labor, roll over our lives just to get that rate of return. Today's presentation has a long title, and there was a subtle little change in it. Main title is Mean, Stupid Money. Subtitle, How Debt Money Used the Monetary System to Destroy the American Dream and How We Can Bring It Back. So I'll leave it at this. Dr. Robbins, very welcome. Were you given sharing privilege?
I think so.
Okay, then floor is yours, and I'm looking forward again for a good presentation from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Govert, and thanks for the kind words. Thanks also for the organizers of the conference. And some of the papers, I think, have been terrific. I've enjoyed every one. I've learned from everyone. You mentioned that, I was an anthropologist, and yes, but one of the reasons I went into anthropology is that you could do almost anything and call it anthropology. And I've done economics, religion, identity theory, and a whole bunch of other areas. But I want to use my anthropology today to explain something about what's happened to really contemporary life. And anthropologists in the past had an interesting approach where they would try to define and describe a culture based upon a specific trait or practice, showing how it permeated into virtually all aspects of social life, economics, politics, society, religion, etc. Think about horses among the Plains Indians of North America. Think about cattle among the cultures and societies of Central Africa. Trading patterns among the Pacific Islanders. And I want to take a look at debt money as that, in effect, central characteristic. And the idea that, again, money is a thin veil, you don't have to look at it, etc., strikes me in various levels as absurd if you don't consider the fact that we create money as interest-bearing debt. And others, such as, again, Michael Hudson, Stephen Zarlinga, Ellen Brown, among others, argue that debt money is not just an instrument, but a structuring principle of contemporary life. And I want to pursue that idea. And specifically, I want to look at three things that come out of issuing money as debt. One, it demands perpetual and exponential economic growth. And a number of you have already, again, mentioned that. Adrian made that a central point of his book on the ecology of money. And as we'll see, that's a critical element. And I want to look at what some of the consequences of that are. I want to also show how debt money creates an ever-expanding level of economic inequality. And again, we're getting back here again to Michael Hudson, and again, how he sees that occurring. I want to show also that it promotes the establishment of autocratic power and how it emerges almost directly out of debt money. And finally, once established, I want to suggest that there's only one agency to challenge that power, and that's the market. And I'll talk a little later about what I mean by the market and why I think it's so essential. I want to first just very briefly, though, go back to where this all started. It all started in what I refer to as the Grand Bargain of 1694, and William III's problem of not having enough money to continue his war with France. And the bargain consisted of an arrangement with the governors, became the governors of the Bank of England. It's actually initially a bond issue from about 1,200 citizens of London that created the Bank of England and granted with the right to establish money as interest-bearing debt. What the bank lent William 1.2 million pounds. There was an annual handling fee of 400 pounds. And that very much started the whole idea. And this had various consequences that I think are central. One, it institutionalized the means of money creation in which privately owned institutions, largely banks, create money as interest-bearing debt. Second, because banks create only the principal and not the interest, they lock the modern economy into the requirement for perpetual exponential growth. Three, it ensured a steady flow of monetary resources to those who own interest-bearing financial instruments. Just as one example, sovereign debt generates every single year $2 trillion for investors of sovereign bonds. Fourth, it financialized the national debt, creating a system of payments to bondholders based primarily on the requirement that states must borrow money to operate, backed by its power to tax its citizens. Again, there's only 3 countries in the world that don't have a national debt: Brunei, Macau, and Liechtenstein. And every other country, in effect, has money that it is funneling to bondholders. Fifth, it set a benchmark for the expected rate of return on capital of 4 to 8%, and serves as a model for the creation of millions, hundreds of millions of more debt-based monetary streams. And finally, the Grand Bargain locked financial institutions and the nation state into a partnership dedicated to maintaining economic growth at a benchmark rate of return at any cost. Let me first take a look at perpetual growth. I want to illustrate for you how we can see how this in effect is happening. Because loans include interest, the total debt exceeds the money in circulation at the start for people, households, firms, governments. To repay both principal and interest, the economy must generate more money, or more economic activity. Again, it's quite simply, if the economy doesn't grow, borrowers cannot earn enough to repay principal and interest, defaults rise, banks take losses, credit tightens, consumption and investment fall. Again, ultimately, you get recession, depression, or in fact, total economic collapse. I want to simply sort of illustrate this for you, how this works. This is a chart. I'm not going to talk about the whole thing, but I want to use it to show, again, how, in fact, perpetual growth impacts us. I was looking a number of years ago for some estimate of how much countries had to grow to pay off their sovereign debt. And I found a study at McKinsey in 2015, Debt and Not Much Deleveraging, in which they took the number of countries listed on the left, and they calculated how much they had to grow to begin to pay off their sovereign debt, not pay it off, to begin to pay off their sovereign debt. Spain, for example, would have had to grow at 5.5%, United Kingdom 4.7%, France 4%, and so on down the line. Only Germany, in their calculations in 2015, didn't have to grow. We'll see in a minute how that worked out. Then they calculated projected growth rates. And as you see, again, nowhere did projected growth rates, except for Germany, were they large enough to start to pay off their debt. The actual growth rates, which I filled in here, show basically the same thing, except even Germany now has to grow at 1.8%. And then I put in the growth rates of 2024, and you can see it hasn't changed. Now, you can see here that, again, countries have got to grow to pay off their debt, and we're only dealing with sovereign debt here. If we take a look at global debt, which is now approximately 324 trillion, depending on your calculations, you see how great the issue is. Public sovereign debt, actually that's a little higher now, it's about 110% of around $110 trillion. Household debt, non-financial, financial sector debt, et cetera. And so you get an idea of, again, how in effect we're locked into this system where we have to grow just to avoid collapse. Give you an idea, in 2017, US GDP was just over $18 trillion, double its size since 1996. Today, it stands at over 37 trillion. 2017, global debt stood at about 70 trillion, over 20 times what it was in 1967. Today, it stands at about 110 trillion. If the US economy grew at the minimum real rate of 3% recommended by most economists, close to the growth rate of Japan from 1900 to 2000, US GDP in 2100 would be $200 trillion, or 600 times what it was spent and produced in 1950. And since emerging nations tend to grow at a higher rate than wealthy nations, we'll look at that later also, global GDP would approach or exceed 1,000 trillion or $1 quadrillion. But there's another problem, and that's really the growth dilemma that countries face. First, it's exponential. At an annual growth rate of 3%, output must double approximately every 4 years. One problem. Secondly, growth rates are slowing. US and global rates of economic growth have slowed by, again, 1% over the decade from 2000 to the present. Now, there's various reasons, again, why this is happening. One is the exponential problem. Just to give you an idea, if, for example, you took the growth of the automobile industry, and they were producing roughly, say, 50,000 cars in 2000, and they had to grow by 3% every single year, well, that 3% gets added on. So that in 2005, they may only have to produce 55,000 cars. The next time, they would have to produce 60,000 cars, and so on and so forth. I did some rough calculations, the auto industry and the lumber industry, that indicates, again, how that, how that happens. So you've got a problem. One, you've got to grow. And two, it's getting slower to grow. So growth is getting slower. That means you've got to pedal even harder, constantly to maintain, what's happening. The question I want to ask as an anthropologist is, how do you keep growing? And more importantly, what are the externalities of the growth? And I want to look at some of the things that come out of this need for growth, dictated by issuing money as interest-bearing debt. Some are simple. The environment. You keep producing more and buying, and people have to buy more. You're going to damage the environment. Climate change is obviously a big issue. Well, again, we're not getting that far with climate change. Now, fortunately, we're getting a little bit better, particularly with battery power, electric power, rather than fossil fuels. But again, it's still a problem. Pollution and toxic waste. Got another issue that emerges out of the perpetual growth scenario. Species extinction. This is a photo taken by Chris Jordan, artist in the state of Washington. Unaltered stomach contents of Lasian albatross, fledgling. He visited Midway Island. The island was literally covered with dead fledglings with toxic waste or waste in general in their stomachs. And we're losing species. We lost about 15,000 in the past couple of years. Admittedly, there are many more. But again, if this is growing exponentially, you can see what kind of problems we're facing. Another consequence of having to grow is the continuing financialization, monetization, commodification of everyday life. Market has to capture things that used to be informal, social, or private. But GDP growth increasingly relies on drawing more aspects of ordinary life, attention, leisure, caregiving, even gambling impulses, into monetized frameworks. Just an example of some of the new things that are emerging that have been in effect monetized to keep this whole process going. Digital advertising, a big thing. It's $250,000 now, and actually it's higher. Subscription streaming, sports betting. If you watch American television now, especially sports events, you get bombarded with betting apps and have a bet. That only became possible when the Supreme Court decided in 2017 that states could regulate gaming laws. And immediately, big money came in, and state legislatures one by one changed their laws to allow it. Now it's 37 legislatures states as legalized betting. Video game consumption, pet industry expenditures. We spend a lot more on pet than we do on childcare. Home healthcare market, telehealth audience. You begin to get an idea of what's in fact happening. I think gaming is one example. There's an estimate of who plays video games. 61 to 65% of Americans report playing video games at least 1 hour a week. And 40 to 50% of the world's population are considered gamers. Now, again, what does this do in terms of time allocation? I took this is a government time use survey in 2024 to see how Americans spend their time. And they allocated, again, approximately how many hours on average people spend on different things. Well, think about the commodification of these activities, sleeping. Americans apparently have a hard time sleeping. And now you've got all kinds of sleeping aids that are available. Personal care, everything that is monetized and continues to be monetized in personal care. Family tasks, cooking and cleaning, childcare, eating and drinking. We'll get to food in a second. And so on and so forth. Computer screen time and what's happening with that. You can also get an idea of how much is being monetized by looking at what's happening to life stages. Birth, hospital births, all kinds of ways to spend money, infancy and childhood, adolescence, tutoring, test prep, social media platforms, gaming, teen fashion, cosmetics, adulthood, so on and so forth. And death, of course, is largely commodified completely, and getting even more so. Now, some of the changes in social patterns that emerge from this are changing the way people interact with each other. It was 25 years ago that Robert Putnam wrote his best-selling book, Bowling Alone, that demonstrated the decline of civic activities in the United States. Sherry Turkle, Life on the Screen, and how computer use, this was the mid-90s, was affecting students or kids' personal relationships. Extremely Online, the most recent book, that talks about the influence of the internet on people's personal relationships. One of the interesting series of studies, it was by Jean Twenge, who wrote a number of books about what's happening in terms of child life. And again, the increase in suicides, the increase of reporting being alone, and so on and so forth. One anecdote, by the way, in terms of loneliness, marketing tends to depend upon demanding the undivided attention of people who advertising is being directed to. Once I was with my daughter, my then 12-year-old daughter in New York. We wandered into a store, I think it was Abercrombie and Fitch, and the music was blaring out loud, so you couldn't hear anything other than the music. And I was talking to my students about it. I said, the reason I do this is to make sure you pay attention only to the product, not talking with each other. And one of my students raised her hand and said, no, she said, it's to keep the parents out. And again, it's that degree of separation necessary to make advertising and marketing effective. Food, we could go on for a lot of time, but food industry doesn't produce food for you to eat, but for you to buy. And that makes all the difference. And their whole strategy, and they have to do it, as we'll see, is to draw on whatever they can, for example, our biological propensity for sugar, to get us to eat more. I don't think you can understand the growth of obesity without understanding the food industry necessity to grow. And again, you can't understand that without considering the role of debt money. Continuing privatization of the commons, things that were state or government run, have been privatized at an alarming rate. We're not going to go through this whole thing, but in utilities, transportation, corrections, military and security, education, et cetera. There's a growing tendency for these things to be bought, particularly, by the way, by private equity, as we heard on last Friday, with Gretchen's Morgenstern's work on what, in effect, is how private equity is literally buying our lives. That is almost all the activities we're involved with, beginning with birth, childcare, right on to death. Interesting case is the decline of privacy and the increase of surveillance. An interesting story, sort of an interesting anecdote of how this all happened. Model for credit reporting agencies was established, you see here, in 1841 by Lewis Tappan. And it followed a flood of bankruptcies after the panic of 1837. And he established the Mercantile Agency with the goal, as he said, for the purpose of procuring by residential and special agents information respecting the standing responsibility of country merchants. It's not a system of espionage, he said, but the same as merchants usually employ, only on an extended plan to ascertain whether persons applying for credit are worthy of the same and to what extent. Essentially, the mercantile agency was the first credit agency. He also said in his original establishment of the company, false and fraudulent representations by a purchaser are mercilessly exposed by the agency. Plausible swindlers are detected, the weak and competent trader described, and the extravagant checked. Now, over the course of the 19th century, more of these agencies arose. Probably the most successful was the Atlanta Retail Credit Company, founded in 1899, that developed files on millions of Americans over the next 60 years. The information included not just data on credit, capital, and character, but information on individual social, political, and sexual lives as well. Already a magnet for criticism, the outcry against the RCC reached a fever push in the 1960s when the firm revealed plans to computerize its records. The outcry, again, led to Congress passing the Fair Credit Reporting Act that tried to, in effect, control what was available. By the way, the Atlanta's Retail Credit Company changed its name in the 1970s to Equifax, which is still around. Now, understand, again, this growth of credit bureaus, again, all emerges from the need to ensure debt payments. And as you'll see, as I'll mention later, they have done an amazing job in disciplining the population to pay their debts. Rachel Botsman wrote a great book, I think it came out in 2003, Who Can You Trust? And she talks about government agencies now using the same information that credit bureaus are establishing to create a citizen score that determines, that shows how trustworthy you are, and that allows people to get access to it, to which it might determine whether you get a mortgage, a job, or even a chance of getting a date. And again, if this sounds extreme, it's basically what in fact is happening in China. China developed its social credit system, which is in the process of expanding. And the credit system, which involves hundreds, if not thousands, of points of data, assigns each citizen a score. And the score can go up or down depending on certain activities. For example, it can go up, by donating blood or money. It can go up by engaging in charity work, praising the government on social media, helping the poor. On the other hand, it can go down, you lose points by not visiting your aging parents, insincere apologies for crimes committed, cheating in online games, spreading rumors on the internet. They actually include in some of this data, whether or not if you're accused of jaywalking. Now, again, this seems extreme, but given the activities this year of Doge in getting access to government records and the establishment of these huge data centers, which we'll talk about a little bit later, points to, in effect, what they learned about debt collection being taken by governments and used as a means of social control. Social credit, again, in effect, constitutes, again, markets in the state, each with their own reason for knowing as much as possible about a person to either collect a debt, a product, or control them. Probably the best book on the issue in general so far I've seen is The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. And she concludes that it represents a coup from above, not that overthrow of the state, rather than overthrow of the people's sovereignty, and so on. And she closes by saying, if the digital future is home, then it must, that is we who must make it so. Then we get to finance. And finance faces the same dilemma of everyone else. They have to grow. And finance has the same problem that the rest of the society does in terms of keeping that growth going. And there was a study came out in a number of places by Oscar Yorta and his associates called The Rate of Return on Everything, 1870 to 2015. And they took data on the rate of return from 17 countries and calculated what the rates of return were in each of those countries over specific periods. Now, what they didn't do is talk about, again, why growth was so central. And this is something there hasn't been that much done on. That is, how much is economic growth, or say the rate of return on investments, tied to economic growth? And there was a paper done in 2005 called Asset Growth and Asset Returns and Economic Growth by Paul Krugman and Dean Baker that tried to determine the correlation between growth and the rate of return. And they concluded, without going through all the math that they did, that the rate of return on investments depends on economic growth. But again, as I pointed out later, economic growth is slowing. You would then expect the rate of return to be slowing. And it's not. So here on the chart, which I took from the data from rate of return, from 1870 to 2015, the economic growth averaged a little above 3%. Rate of return was 5.89%. After 1950, growth was about 3.25%. Rate of return was 6%. Post 1980, growth was, again, about 2.5% a year, but rate of return got even bigger. Again, 6.97%. Now, the only way this can be happening is if, in fact, finance is capturing more and more of the national income. And sure enough, you have in the past this whole process talked about and theorized. Marx did it, Schumpeter did it, Alfred Chandler did it, more recently, Michael Hudson, Ellen Brown, etc. They've all talked about the fact that firms must expand. Finance has to, in effect, grow for various reasons. And here's a chart that shows exactly how it's happening. Shares of U.S. national income allocated to labor and finance. The red line is labor. Essentially, it's wages, starting from 1960 to 2022, when some of the data wasn't available for later years yet. And you can see the amount of wages as a share of national income has gone down to roughly 10%. The share taken by finance, that is dividends, interest, capital gains, and rents as a percent of GDP, increased steadily, dipped a little bit during the problems in the 1980s, went up. Just prior to the subprime mortgage crisis, it actually surpassed the amount taken by labor and went down because of the recession, and has since climbed again back up again. Now, what this represents is the subset of workers, as opposed to a much smaller subset of investors, taking a much larger share of the national income. And I think what this represents is that debt has created what essentially Michael Hudson predicted, a two-tier society of creditors and debtors. Now, there were no longer laborers and capitalists. We're debtors and creditors. And it has all kinds of implications. I'll show you some of the rates of return that can be realized now by finance. These are three of the most successful funds. Renaissance Technology is George Soros's quantum fund, and Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's firms. And these are their average annual returns over the past 20 years. Renaissance Technologies, particularly the Medallion Fund, has earned a return of 66% a year average 66% a year over that period. Quantum, about 30%, Berkshire Hathaway, 20%. There are any numbers in the 15, 10% ranges. Now, given how that's happening, you can get, again, a better idea of how finance has to be in effect, sucking up more and more. Now, how they did it is interesting. I won't go into that. If you want to, during, when we have our discussion session, we can talk more about how finance has done that. But it's obviously, as you'll see in other ways, had an enormous impact on our society and our politics. Second essentially element that has resulted from debt money is, of course, economic inequality. Poem by poor Lawrence Dunbar. This is the debt I pay. This last part of it. Slight was the thing I bought. Small was the debt I thought. Poor was the loan at best. God but the interest. And interest is critical. I mean, interest is, in effect, a regressive tax on money. That is, somebody has granted, basically to banks, the right to charge interest on issued money. And essentially, it's a tax that is going to support, generally, the holders of debt instruments, the creditor class, in effect. I'll give you just a rough idea. This is interest and total U.S. government revenue. It's 1960 to 23. Again, interest has been, far more to come up. We pay more in interest than we pay in federal taxes. That has really jumped in 21 and 22 for reasons we'll talk about a little bit later. But again, it gives you an idea of the extent, and that's again, $6 trillion in interest that's paid out annually, essentially. Get another idea of how inequality is created, just looking at the average annual percent increases in wages compared to stocks, bonds, corporate bonds, etc. Since 1985 to 2003, wages have gone up at the rate, wages have gone up at the rate of 3.72% a year. S&P 500, 12.77%. U.S. bonds, almost 6.5%. Corporate bonds, 8.65%. Real estate, gold, etc. Now, again, when in effect creditors, finance, the investor class, is realizing returns like this, and workers are realizing a return like that, the mystery of why we have growing inequality disappears. It doesn't have to be globalization, doesn't have to be education. It's simply, in effect, how the rules, the financial rules, advantage a certain category of people. This, again, I want to only emphasize part of this. This essentially is the income generating, who holds these income generating assets? That is the stocks, the bonds, gold, rents, etc. And in this chart, I tried to show the growth, but just focus here on 2019, which is the last I have, last of the data. But you can see the total assets for the group, 53.9% in 2019. Next 9%, 36%. You get to the bottom 9%, they hold 9.2% of these assets, mostly in pension funds, mostly in retirement funds. Total debt, on the other hand, again, the bottom 90% has almost 3/4 of the total debt, and so on and so forth. So it just demonstrates the extent to which the investor class is a fairly small aspect, a small group of our society. Let's say the top 10%. Debt creates crises. Again, one of the problems with debt is you get periodic issues where either credit declines or you get, for example, as we did in 2007, 2008, massive defaults on mortgage debt. Another chart is a study by Paula Cherchevna, reorienting fiscal policy. And what she did was take a look at economic expansions and then the following contractions. And then she calculated how different groups, the bottom 90% in the gray line and the top 10% did after the contraction. That is, how well did they respond? As you can see here, again, the bottom 90% did okay until we get finally to the 1980s, when suddenly the top 10% is doing much better. And then again, in 2001 to 2007, this takes it to 2012, just came out with a paper where she took a look at it using the data from 2022. And I have a chart, but she asked me not to show it because it's not published yet. But essentially, the top 1% have gained 110% of what was lost after the COVID contraction. The bottom 90% has lost 10%. So once again, you see with crises what in fact is happening. The reason really is that one of the things that crises has created, for reasons we can discuss later if you'd like, is it creates debt. Mark Lastry, who was the CEO of Avenue Capital, said as COVID hit, he said, I know you're not supposed to say this, but it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. You're not going to see this again where you've actually got an economy that's fine and you've got a Fed pumping trillions of dollars in. Now, by the way, I'm not blaming Mark Lastry to see gold in COVID. But what he's saying is simply the truth. That is one of the things that happened with COVID is there was an enormous increase in debt. In fact, approximately some $24 trillion as a consequence of COVID was introduced into the economy, again, as a form of debt, creating assets for people who own those assets, like Mark Lastry. Sovereign debt, a little over 12%, corporate debt, 5.4%, banks, 3.9%, households, again, borrowed extensively. $24 trillion in new debt was absorbed by institutional investors and central banks. And this simply breaks down the amount and the percentage of each of these groups. Now, when you take all of that and combine it, that is how money is distributed, the split between creditors and debtors, the growth of the investment class, et cetera. This is what the US economy looks like by households in 2024. What I try to do is not only show a percentage and things, but also show number of households. It doesn't quite give it a face, but it gives it a little bit of a face. So here you've got the top 1%. They hold 30% of the nation's wealth. 1.3 million households compose that 1%. You go down to the 90 to 99th percentile. That consists of 12 million households. They hold 38.4% of the national wealth. You get out of the middle group, 51 to 89%. They hold 31.20% of the wealth. That's 42 million households. Finally, this very thin line here at the bottom of the pyramid represents 66.6 million households, bottom 50%. They hold 2.44% of the national wealth. And here you get a sense of the really the grotesque inequality in our society. Now, we can also look at this breakdown and include divisions by race. And then the differences get even starker. And to give you an idea, just to see what it's like for a household. Well, just one quick thing. This doesn't count, by the way, the latest Trump budget reconciliation law. The Congressional Budget Office figured out who gains, who loses. And of course, again, the bottom 10%, the second 20%, et cetera, are losing the most. And again, to give you a sense of what it means in terms of day-to-day living. This is a chart of the ratio of income paid each month for credit card debt. That is for each income decile. The bottom 10% pay almost 85% of their income to pay off credit card debt. And what that means is they're living on their credit cards. They're in effect, again, borrowing to pay, borrowing to pay, borrowing to pay. The 20th percentile, much the same thing, paying more than 60% of their income on credit card debt. Again, and of course, the bottom, the top 10 percentile, again, much smaller percent, just in terms of daily life. Those are some of the social economic externalities of debt money. And again, the biggest, again, is that movement of money upward. But it also involves the growth and the concentration of wealth and power, something that Michael Hudson also talked to us about, last week. And, you can see it, for example, excuse me, you can see it in the growth of the number of global billionaires over the past, over the past essentially 25 years, through in 1987 here, where again there were just a few. There's now over 3,000 billionaires, and together they hold again getting up to $17 trillion of total worth. By the way, that would qualify them to be the third richest country in the world, just behind China, but not very much. Oxfam, this is from Forbes. Oxfam put out a fairly large report on the growth of billionaires and the consequences. Oxfam predicted there'll be at least 5 trillionaires a decade from now. 204 new billionaires were minted in 2024, nearly 4 every week. Now, we've got one already, apparently Elon Musk, with a deal with the board at Tesla. It will now have almost over $1 trillion in assets. 60% billionaire wealth is now derived from inheritance, monopoly power, or crony connections. As Oxfam argues, extreme billionaire wealth is largely unmerited. This is one of the major findings, of course, Thomas Piketty in his book, Capital in the 21st Century. Richest 1% in the global north extracted $30 million an hour from the global south through the financial system in 2023. And Oxfam urges government to tax the richest to reduce inequality and extreme wealth and dismantle the new aristocracy. And here's an example of it. Trump's essentially billionaires. Now, I've picked Elon Musk and Robert Mercer, one, to illustrate how this works. Musk, who now may be a trillionaire, donated probably $250 million to the 2024 election, has claimed, perhaps with merit, that without his money, Donald Trump would not have been elected president. The figures on the left are Robert Mercer and his daughter, Rebecca. Robert Mercer is an interesting story of how this wealth has emerged. Mercer was a learning language programmer, learning language specialist, AI, and was brought into Jim Simon's Renaissance Technology Fund, particularly the Medallion Fund, which was the one that made 66% a year. And Mercer's an interesting guy. He's a devoted and avid libertarian. He hated Hillary Clinton, hated her so much that he donated a whole bunch of money to Ted Cruz in the 2016 election. And when Cruz didn't make it, he turned his wealth to Donald Trump. One of the things he did is he put Trump at one point, if you remember this, was losing badly to Clinton. That's when Clinton's poll numbers were 10, 15% ahead. And Trump's campaign was not going anywhere. And Mercer came in and introduced Donald Trump to Steve Bannon. and Breitbart, media, and really turned Trump's campaign around. One of Mercer's colleagues at Renaissance Technology claimed that without Mercer, Trump never would have been elected president. And so you get a sense of some of the micro management aspects of the influence of great wealth. And again, Trump's staff and administration, again, is just full of millionaires. You can sort of go around. There's only some of them. Now, one question you have is how is wealth translated into power? And don't forget, we're here looking at more externalities of debt money. They get wealth. Wealth goes up. Now, but how, though, do they then translate it into power? And I want to give you just some examples. One, and the obvious one, of course, the obvious factor, is campaign finance. And this is just one chart from one analysis. This comes from Forbes also, of the who donated to who in the 2022 election cycle. Interestingly, again, Trump depended on almost 87% came from finance and investment. Democrats also depended on it, which again is part of the dilemma, but only 34% of the money that they raised came from that source. And you can see on the chart, again, where some of these other sources came from. Now, you can get a lot more data, and they've published a lot on Open Secrets, which is the site where you can find out, again, a lot about, campaign finance reform and campaign finance. And obviously, that's a main way in which you take wealth and you translate it into power. Think of all of the lobbyers. I don't know if it was David Korten mentioned last week, that every bank, when it comes to lobbying, has 3 lobbyers or 4 lobbyers out there working working Congress to get legislation passed or not passed if it's harmful. Again, using money influence. Good book, and probably one of the best it sort of deals with this, is Martin Gillen's Affluence and Influence, of how, again, money is translated into power. And in one paper he wrote with his colleague Edward Page, concluded that when preferences of economic elites organized interest is controlled, essentially the preference of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. I mean, we are a plutocracy, and the vote as a means of effecting change has declined considerably. And when we look at some things we can do to change the situation, we have to consider whether the vote, in fact, means anything anymore. Another way you convert how you convert money to political power are through things such as media. This is just a rough chart to show, again, who owns significant media: Newsmax, Breitbart, CNN, CBS, Fox. This has all been in the news lately, of course, with Jimmy Kimmel's removal and return to television, Sinclair, Nexstar, et cetera. Again, most of these are owned by people with, again, political goals. Perry Sook, the Murdoch family, of course, with Fox, Sinclair, the Smith family, and so on and so forth, Mercer family and Breitbart. So one way, obviously, is simply you control the media, you control the flow of information, and you can do what Fox does very well. It reports the news, but it also spins the news. And then you get into the whole argument in media, whether or not it's always spin or et cetera. But it takes money and translates into really important influences. Here's a latest photo of Masayoshi Son of SoftBank, Sam Altman of OpenAI, and Larry Ellison of Oracle, credited Trump for helping to make their Stargate project possible. Stargate is the building of massive data centers in Texas, in which these three billionaires, each one is a billionaire, these billionaires have in effect, are projecting to invest $500 billion in the building of these data centers. Now, the problem at a number of levels. Number one, environmental. These data centers take enormous amounts of power. One reason they do it in Texas is because Texas is doing okay with power, not because of fossil fuels, ironically, but because they generate more wind power than any state in the country. Which again is ironic because, of course, as we'll see in a second, Trump is destroying wind power and solar power and any alternative energy power other than fossil fuels. So again, here again, wealth is being turned into power. I want to again to get down to sort of lower levels influences and tell you about a story that is actually developing. Law firms are threatening Brown University, particularly Brown's Climate and Development Lab, threatening them with $1 billion lawsuit. And they want the lab to withdraw a study it did called Against the Wind that they put out in 2023. They want the study withdrawn, destroyed. They want the people who did the study fired. I know one of them, Timmons Roberts. Because what it does is show the influence of money in the anti-wind lobby. So that you have, well, they developed, I'm not going to go into detail, but I'll show you what in effect they developed. What they did is they traced the money that was going to anti-wind groups, that is, those that were campaigning against wind power, and broke it down into the larger groups. For example, the American Coalition for Ocean Protection against wind power, Save Right Whales, because they thought environmentalists who were sensitive about whales could be brought on board to be against the establishment of wind power offshore. And they trace, again, all of these lines of influence funding the campaign against wind power. Now, as you would expect, again, almost all of these larger groups are funded by the Koch network. That, again, establish these groups, again, put people in charge of them very often. I say fund them, but essentially try to make it seem as if these are grassroots movements. Now, this is not the Kochs or the Koch, one brother died a couple of years ago, doing this. Rather, this is a grassroots movement, democratic movements coming from the people, opposed to, in some way or another, to wind power. They figured out it was over $16 million, or 16 was donated to again these groups, and this just scratches the surface. Money going to establish grassroots movements, think tanks, and so on and so forth, to argue against one thing or another. Another excellent study about this, by the way, is Catherine Stewart's Money, Lies, and God. And Stewart's been following the religious right for now, I think it's about 15 years. This is her second book on them. And in the book, she describes how, again, wealthy families are funding what look like grassroots movement, like the Good News Club, which is trying to undermine public education, laying the groundwork for dismantling public education in favor of a private system of religious education funded by the state. Now, education is one of the major areas that investors have funded for commodification, for privatization. And slowly, they're able to do this. Now, let me back up just 1 second, though, and get back to something I said earlier, that in a sense, the investors have to do this. Because if, in fact, they're going to grow and get a benchmark rate of return on investments in an environment in which economic growth is slowing, they have to work harder and harder to get what they need. That means more influence, more grassroots movements, takeover of media, and so on and so forth. So anyway, we get finally to part 5 of the presentation. What can we do about it? And I've heard over the course of these 2 weekends at the conference, terrific ideas about things that can be done. We just heard today from Gergely and Horvath, again, a perfect illustration of why going to sovereign money, public money, is the best thing to do. And they lay it out, perfectly, as did Professor Yamaguchi, last Friday. And we heard more from others about, what we can do. The question is, again, how do you do it? That is, what's powerful enough to challenge the autocracy? Remember what Frederick Douglass famously said, power concedes nothing without demand. Well, how do you assert demand? And I put this picture up of Liz Truss during the turmoil when she had her brief reign as prime minister. And the news was simply the market revolted. The market revolted. Truss was trying to put in a program of extreme austerity, a country that had already been devastated by austerity. And the bond markets just revolted against it because it was going to raise the interest that had been paid on government debt and so on and so forth. And I think the message here is what I mentioned, in my opening statement, that essentially only the market is the only thing that Trump and his supporters fear. So how do you, again, utilize the market to actually do something? Now, the ideas are good, and they're logical, and they make economic, social sense, etc. But how do you get the power, which is, again, basically now, lodged in the wealthy, to make changes? And here's the point I think that's important. We're the market. Almost all the country's wealth flows through households in the form of income, spending, savings, debt repayment, and tax payments. More than 30% of it flows through only the top 1%, but that represents a potential party of the 99%. So what do? Well, you can threaten to interrupt some of those flows, and you hit directly at the oligarchy. Now, I want to go back again to Michael Hudson's history of debt. And how, again, when you had, for example, Jubilee, et cetera, it was because rulers were generous. It was because they had to maintain the allegiance of their farmers, clients, et cetera. And so debt was forgiven. When, in fact, you don't have to do that, when you don't have to share resources, et cetera, then people won't do it. You want to get into more on that. There was a wonderful study in anthropology years ago, Frederick Barth. The study was called Political Leadership Among the Swat Pathans. I actually wanted to mention it last week when Michael Hudson was talking, because it's sort of an example of what he was talking about, where chiefs in SWAT had to maintain the allegiance of their farmers from whom they collected tribute. They hated the farmers as fighters because of the competition between groups. Because if, in fact, he didn't take care of his farmers, they would pick up and go join another chief. And that maintained the balance. It all went haywire when the British came in, did away with war and fighting, and essentially froze the wealth of the chiefs so they didn't have to share it anymore. Again, an example as I say, again, the kinds of checks and balances you have and don't have. Now, I maintain that workers, excuse me, finally gained a seat at the negotiating table. Excuse me again. Only when they threaten to withhold their labor. What we can do now is get people to threaten to withhold, reduce spending, withdraw money from banks. Best yet, withhold debt payments. While the oligarchs, again, withhold an estimated 20% of their tax obligations, debtors are delinquent at less than 2% of theirs. In Debt is Power, Tim DeMuso and I proposed essentially a party of the 99%. These were some of the things that were some of the platform. Book is available. It was done under Creative Commons, and it's available, for free at that website. But obviously, reform of the monetary system was number one. And then we listed other issues that we thought were critical. Many would agree with all of them. Some might add some might subtract some. But essentially, you need something of that sort. Now, when I mention something like a debt strike, often people say you can't do that. Well, they've done it already. The Republicans have done it in 1995, 2011, 2013, 21, and 23. When they which would have meant essentially the country would have defaulted on its debt. It's a debt strike. Now, they got backed off. We're in the midst now of another issue in which Democrats may contribute to, again, a default in terms of the thing. But again, withholding debt is not a new thing. And I say the Republicans, if nothing else, established a precedent for it. And then you get, again, other unfairness in honoring financial obligations. We say, well, it's a moral thing. You have to pay your debts. You have to do whatever you need to do. But, for example, tax obligations. The top 400 Americans paid an estimated 23% of their income, Uncle Sam, 2018 to 20, down from 30% before the tax cuts of 2017. They paid 1.3% of their total wealth to the IRS. Their tax rates were lower than the average paid by American households. Using updated IRS data, top 1% likely account for $140 billion a year of unpaid income taxes. The top 1/10 of 1%, 40 billion. These are all simply unreported, using again various methods. Doesn't even include the outsourcing that they do. Internal Revenue did its own service. This was tax years 2014 to 2016. And again, taxes never collected 428 billion, by far, mostly among the creditor class, the investor class. I mentioned, while they, again, hide 20% of their income, others are far more conscientious about debts. They are to the state than we are to the nation state. These are the delinquency rates on loans and mortgages from 1987 to 2003. Again, less than 3% of people. Now, this is what this means: delinquency rates. They miss a debt payment. Sometimes I'll ask people just to see what they think. What percentage of the population you think each month miss a debt payment? And it's incredibly small. I mean, we're disciplined to, in effect, pay our debts. If you look at delinquency, just in credit card and consumer loans, again, consistently, under 6%, usually ranging around 2%. Mortgage rates, generally, mortgage delinquencies are even lower, except, of course, during the subprime crisis, when it jumped up, and now it's gone down considerably. There's other unfairnesses in the economic system that favor the wealthy. For example, unilaterally modified pension agreements between workers and municipal governments. These are just some of those agreements that have occurred over the last 15 years. And what these modified pension agreements do is reduce essentially municipal funding in order to pay off creditors. And these, again, are just simply unilaterally done. This is not done by negotiation. Then you've got the unfairness in bankruptcy laws. And this is just, again, a little side by side, how individual bankruptcy is much more severe than corporate bankruptcies. If you get down to the bottom, ultimate outcomes, often liquidation of financial restart with personal hardship. Corporations restructuring, rebirth, sometimes emerging stronger and more profitable. Then, and I threw this in, I'm not sure it necessarily belongs, although it may. And this was a statement I'd made on a blog that the larger issue concerns the likelihood, and this gets to voting, larger issue concerns the likelihood of a president who refused to accept the loss of election when he controlled only a part of the Republican Party, accepting defeat with the whole power of government, Congress, the Justice Department, Supreme Court, the military, etc., along with the private militia behind him. This again is referring to the election of 2022 and then obviously in 2026. In addition, with so much of the extreme right agenda implemented and with much more to come, there's too much at stake and too much money behind it to accept or risk defeat. I don't know whether Las Vegas or the multitude of betting apps out there have yet posted odds on this administration giving up power under any circumstances, but I placed them at close to nil. I mentioned before, given the influence of money in politics, the power of the vote has been greatly diminished. It's very possible we're going to reach a crisis point where the vote doesn't mean anything at all. And then the question is, what's left? And so, again, you need a strategy. As I said, I want to go back to Sam Hummel's talk last week and his research. Sam, remember, did research with civic groups to see to what extent they would be interested in partnering with or considering the issue of money creation as part of their platform. Found out most of them really didn't know much about money. Only a small number knew that it was created by banks as interest-bearing debt. But I started thinking of all the areas of life impacted by issuing money as interest-bearing debt. And I gather that almost any group, be they poverty, we talked about poverty last night, be it environmental, be it social justice, etc., that doesn't, to some extent, relate back to the issue of debt money. So here's a proposal of what we can do. Now, understand, again, we've had some great proposals in terms of policies, but that doesn't get you anywhere unless you have a strategy for implementing it, particularly for addressing power. As we can see now with Donald Trump, I mean, destroying wind power makes no sense. But again, he's getting his money there, again, from the fossil fuel. Remember, he asked the fossil fuel folks to give him $1 billion for re-election, and he'd do all kinds of things for them. We don't know what they gave him because so much of that is secret. But it made a big impact.
Richard, a quick question. I just noticed Howard isn't here, so I'm going to step in as moderator. His connection.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to mention we have 8 minutes left.
I'm done.
A minute.
I'm done with this slide.
Okay.
2 more slides.
Perfect timing.
Okay, perfect timing.
Thank you.
All right. One strategy is declaring Liberation Month. Of course, Donald Trump declared Liberation Day with his tariffs, but of course backed off. Put them ahead 90 days, once the market reacted. And there's a hierarchy of actions that households can take as a way of expressing protest. Now, I equate this to the sort of same thing that often happens in Europe when you have a mass walkout of labor. No specific issue may be mentioned, but just general dissatisfaction with what's taken. So you've got a hierarchy of action. You cut spending by 10%. Now, of all things, last week on Substack, Paul Krugman, talking about the Jimmy Kimmel incident. So how can we make Trump implosion more likely? The public can help by doing what Target's customers and Disney's audience did. Make it clear they will stop paying money to institutions that lend aid and comfort to the authoritarian project. Paul Krugman. Now, remember, going back to Professor Mayushi's talk last week, Krugman, you talk about monetary reform and you'll lose your job, you're dead in academia. And with Yamaguchi's case, exactly what happened. So here Paul Krugman is talking about using, in effect, payments to make a protest. You can withdraw money from banks. Michael Melio, remember I think last week, made the point that your bank deposits are loans to the bank. Call in your loans. Banks do it. And finally, withhold debt payments. Again, it's a withholding of payments, analogous to the withholding of labor, not a refusal to pay debts. Question. Okay, how many people would have to do this to have any impact whatsoever? Maybe only 3.5%. I don't know if you've seen this. It's an interesting study that was done at Harvard by Erica Chisowith at the Carr Center. And the study indicated that with 3.5% of a 3.5% of a population opposing an administration, they almost always win. They almost back down. And I can show you if you want to in discussion, what their statistics are and how it worked. There's only a couple of instances where 3.5% didn't work. One was in Brunei, where they had 6%, but nothing actually happened. But in every other case, they looked at all cases of resistance or revolt from 1945. I think it was 2000. I'll look at that. And to see what percent of the population participated in demonstrations, et cetera, and whether or not the demonstrations were successful. She said, in summary, 3.5 figures a descriptive statistic based on a sample of historical movements. By the way, one of the biggest demonstrations in US history was the Women's March on Washington. That involved 1.6% of the American population. She estimates 3.5 would basically mean about 11 million people. 5% participate metric may use the rule of thumb, she says. New research suggests that One Nile movement failed, Bahrain failed, but large peak participation size is associated with movement success. Now, taking financial action, withholding spending, withdrawing your loan, not paying your debt, a little bit different. And it's different because you don't have the movement where people getting together are physically getting together. And you don't get that sense of solidarity. This has to be an ask that essentially depends upon people, essentially, mostly in front of their computer, taking action. But 3.5%, when you've got mass dissatisfaction, is a fairly small number. Now, I don't.
Dr. Professor Robbins.
Yes.
By the way, Stephen, I'm still here. We're getting very close to the end.
I'm done. I'm done.
Let's give Ellen Brown the question.
It's almost squeezed out questions, but we'll go very fast to questions. And Ellen Brown is at top. And Ellen,
hello, Ellen.
Go ahead. There she is.
Hello.
Hi, thank you for the very interesting presentation. And I have two questions. First of all, what exactly would we be protesting? I mean, if we don't pay our debt.
Excellent question. And that's why I compare it to a walkout.
Who would we be protesting to? And what is it? The banks can't really change the monetary system, even if we don't, we defaulted on our debts.
Right.
So that's one question, and I have another comment.
Go ahead. You want to give me the other one too? And
Okay, well, my other was a comment. I totally agree that debt is a huge problem. Interest is a huge problem, and it's a source of much unearned income. But it seems to me an even bigger source is speculation, just sheer outright speculation, like in the stock market or in Bitcoin or, cryptocurrency in general, where the stock market is not. I mean, those big investors are making, those big funds are making their money in the stock market. Well, somebody must be losing if they're making, and yet the market just keeps going up. Why is that? I mean, they're just new investors that keep getting sucked in because they think this is the way to have my money making money and it's the best investment around. I mean, it's just a comment. I don't know what we could do about it, but it seems to me that we have a pretty challenging issue here with.
Oh, no, that's a very, I don't know how much time I have to respond, Stephen, but
Go ahead.
let me take the second one because it's an interesting one. And David Korten also commented on it, about how much of our economy and how much investment is simply speculation. The best example I know of, say, is take options. You get a corn farmer makes a deal with an option dealer to be paid, $4.50 for his a bushel of corn at harvest time. Well, that option then becomes a negotiable instrument. Is then used by the investor, is sold, traded, etc. And so by the time the corn is actually produced and picked up, that may have changed hands 10, 15, 20 times and produced absolutely nothing. And the point is that essentially what the markets are it's simply, again, betting. To some extent, markets are essentially bookies. They're taking something, be it stocks, be it cryptocurrency, being commodities, etc., and they're placing odds on that based upon the investors they get. And the winners are the people who win the bets, as they would with a bookie. The losers are those who lost their bets, because there's going to be somebody on each side of the bet. So your initial answer to who's gaining and who's losing, the better who wins the bet wins, the one that the investor who loses. But here's the issue. In order to that to happen, finance had to use its influence to implement government policies, beginning with inflation, taxes, labor, regulation, antitrust, debt repayment, etc., that systematically dispossesses the people outside that arrangement. Now, there's investors like to say, particularly with some of these, well, the people who are losing are one of the guys at Jim Simon's fund said, who are we taking the money from? The 66% annual return. And the answer was, we're taking it from dentists. Because dentists, for some reason, had a notorious reputation for being lousy speculators. But he was wrong, because he left out all of the impact on everybody else when policies such as taxes, destruction of labor unions, failure to regulate antitrust violations, and so on and so forth, it affects so many more people. I mean, we pay more because of concentration than people in Europe for almost everything.
Professor Robbins, we almost are at a hard stop
we're over
here. It all depends on Stephen. If there's one more question, or we wrap it up now.
No, we
Stephen,
need to wrap it up. We're already over.
Mr. Boss. Okay, we'll wrap it up.
Les Leopold coming on next, and after Les is finished, if whoever's around, we'll have an open conversation, and this will surely be the subject. Robbins has shown us with Gretchen Morgensen, Mercer Baradar, and David Dayan, others, there's a huge amount of pain out there, microeconomic. They're all feeling it. And we got a macroeconomic solution. How are we going to bring action? How are we going to connect? Richard has shown us a number of ways to try that. We have to, Ellen Brown, ourselves, we have to come up with an action plan. And if we can do it together, it'll be stronger. Thank you, Richard Robbins.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Professor Robbins. That was, as usually, a fantastic educational experience.
Okay,
To be continued. How many
four,
minutes shall we
four
have
minutes,
break,
4 minutes,
Stephen?
4 minutes. We'll begin 2 minutes late with Les Leopold. Thank you.
So be it.
So be it. It works. It works.